diplomatic vessel Starlight Horizon moved slowly through the darkness of space toward a station larger than any moon. Ambassador Daniel stood at the observation window and watched as hundreds of alien ships passed by his small vessel. Some of them were so big that the Starlight Horizon looked like a tiny insect next to them. Daniel was 57 years old with gray hair and tired eyes, but today those eyes were wide with wonder and concern. Laura stood beside him. She was 32 years old and had spent the last 3 years of her life learning the common language that most species in the galaxy use to communicate. She was the best linguist on Earth, and that was why she was here. Her job was to make sure nothing was lost in translation during this historic moment. Humanity had discovered faster-than-light travel only 8 years ago. They had explored nearby star systems and found evidence of other intelligent life. Then, 6 months ago, a message had arrived from something called the Galactic Council. It was an invitation for humanity to present itself before the elder races who ruled the galaxy. The United Nations had selected Daniel for this mission because he had spent his entire career bringing people together through words instead of weapons. The Starlight Horizon carried a crew of 32 people. They were scientists, diplomats, translators, and support staff. None of them carried weapons. This was a mission of peace, and Daniel had insisted that they arrive with open hands and open hearts. The station grew larger in the window until it filled their entire view. It was a massive ring structure that floated in space around a dying star. Lights flickered across its surface like a million tiny fires. Laura checked her tablet and told Daniel that the station was home to representatives from over 200 different species. The Galactic Council itself consisted of 12 elder races who had ruled this part of the galaxy for more than 50,000 years. A voice came through the communication system in a language that sounded like grinding stones. Laura listened carefully and translated for Daniel. They were being told to dock at Port 7 and prepare to be escorted to the council chamber. Daniel nodded and gave the order to proceed. The docking procedure took almost an hour. When the airlock finally opened, Daniel saw his first aliens in person. They were tall creatures with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished metal. Their eyes were completely black and they did not blink. One of them spoke, and Laura translated that these were one of the 12 elder races. They would serve as escorts. Daniel smiled and offered his hand in greeting. The looked at his hand with what might have been disgust and turned away without responding. Daniel lowered his hand slowly and exchanged a worried glance with Laura. This was not the welcome they had hoped for. The walk to the council chamber took them through corridors filled with alien species of every shape and size. Some had scales, some had feathers, and some had bodies that seemed to be made of living light. All of them stopped to stare at the humans as they passed. Daniel heard whispers in dozens of languages. Laura caught some of the words and her face grew pale. "They think we are animals," she whispered to Daniel. "They are surprised we can walk upright." Daniel kept his expression calm. He had dealt with prejudice before, though never quite like this. He reminded himself why he was here. Humanity needed allies in the galaxy. They needed trade partners and friends. If that meant enduring some insults, he was prepared to do so. The council chamber was a massive circular room with seats rising up toward a domed ceiling that showed the stars outside. In the center was a small platform where Daniel was expected to stand and address the assembly. The 12 elder races sat in elevated positions around the room, looking down at the platform like judges looking at a criminal. High Chancellor Eth of the Dominion sat in the highest seat of all. He was an ancient creature with gray skin stretched tight over a skull-like face. His eyes were red and burned with cold intelligence. He had led the council for 3,000 years, and in that time he had watched dozens of young species rise and fall. To him, humans were nothing special. They were just another group of primitives who needed to learn their place. Daniel stepped onto the platform and looked up at the assembled representatives. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Laura translated his words into the common tongue. He spoke of Earth and its beauty. He spoke of humanity's long journey from caves to cities to stars. He spoke of their desire for peace and friendship with all species. He spoke of trade and knowledge sharing and cooperation. He spoke of a future where humans and aliens work together to explore the mysteries of the universe. The council listened in silence. When Daniel finished speaking, he waited for a response. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Eth raised one thin hand and the room fell even more silent. High Chancellor spoke in a voice that sounded like ice cracking. Laura translated his words with a trembling voice. Eth said that humanity was young and foolish. He said that the galaxy had rules that all species must follow. He said that humans must surrender all military ships and weapons. They must accept observers on their planet to ensure they did not develop dangerous technology. They must accept their status as a subordinate species under Council protection. These were not requests. These were requirements. Daniel felt his heart beating faster, but he kept his voice steady when he responded. He thanked the High Chancellor for explaining the Council's position. He said that humanity was grateful for the invitation to speak. However, he could not accept these terms. Humanity would remain sovereign and free. They wished to join the galactic community as equals, not as servants. The chamber erupted in noise. Representatives from dozens of species shouted and pointed at the small human on the platform. Eth silenced them with a gesture. He stared down at Daniel with those burning red eyes and spoke again. Laura translated with tears forming in her eyes. The High Chancellor said that Daniel did not understand. This was not a negotiation. Young species did not refuse the Council. They submitted or they were removed. Humanity had 3 days to reconsider. If they still refused after that time, there would be consequences. Daniel stood tall on the platform and met the High Chancellor's gaze. He said that humanity would always choose freedom. He hoped the Council would come to see them as friends rather than subjects. Until then, he would wait for further discussions. The escorts appeared beside him and led the human delegation away. As they walked back to their ship, Laura grabbed Daniel's arm. She asked him what they were going to do. Daniel looked back toward the council chamber and said that they were going to keep talking. They were going to find a way to make peace. That was what humans did best. But deep in his heart, Daniel felt a cold fear growing. He had seen the look in Eth's eyes. It was not the look of someone who wanted to negotiate. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision. 3 days passed on the station while Daniel and his team waited for the council to respond. Each day, Daniel requested meetings with representatives from the elder races. Each day, he was told to wait. The humans were kept in a small section of the station with guards posted at every exit. They were not prisoners, they said, but they were also not free to leave. Laura spent those 3 days monitoring communications with the equipment she had brought from Earth. She was supposed to use it for translation work, but she had learned long ago that listening was often more important than speaking. What she heard in those intercepted messages made her blood run cold. She went to Daniel on the 3rd night and told him what she had discovered. The council had never intended to negotiate. Eth had decided to make an example of humanity before the diplomatic ship had even arrived. The elder races were worried that other young species might start demanding equal treatment. They needed to show the galaxy what happened to those who refused to submit. Daniel listened to her report with a heavy heart. He asked her if she was certain about what she had heard. Laura nodded and said that she had recordings of everything. The council planned to execute the entire diplomatic team in front of representatives from every species in the galaxy. The broadcast would be sent to every corner of known space as a warning. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he gathered his crew in the common room of their quarters and told them what Laura had discovered. Fear spread across their faces, but none of them panicked. These were people who had volunteered to travel across the galaxy into the unknown. They had known the risks when they signed up for this mission. A young engineer named Palmer asked Daniel what they should do. Should they try to fight their way back to the ship? Should they try to escape? Daniel shook his head slowly. He said that fighting would only give the council an excuse to call them violent primitives. Running would only delay the inevitable. They were surrounded by 800 warships. There was no escape. But there was something they could do. Daniel asked Laura if she could send a message back to Earth without the council detecting it. Laura thought about it and said that she could try. It would be risky, but she had some tricks that the aliens might not expect from a primitive species. Daniel told her to prepare a full data package. He wanted her to include everything. The recordings of their arrival, the council demands, the intercepted communications proving this was planned from the beginning, and whatever happened next. Earth needed to know the truth about what the Galactic Council really was. The next morning, an announcement came through the station speakers. The human delegation was invited to a formal dinner in their honor. The council wished to celebrate the beginning of a new relationship between their peoples. Daniel knew it was a trap, but he also knew that refusing would change nothing. He told his people to dress in their best clothes and hold their heads high. The dinner was held in a great hall filled with representatives from across the galaxy. Long tables were covered with food that the humans could not eat and drinks that might have been poison to their bodies. The 12 elder races sat at a raised platform at the head of the room, with Eth in the center. Daniel and his team were led to seats directly in front of the platform. He noticed that there were cameras everywhere, floating devices that recorded everything from multiple angles. This was not just a dinner. This was a stage. Eth stood and raised a glass filled with dark liquid. He spoke in his cold voice, and Laura translated in a whisper. The High Chancellor said that today was a historic day. The humans had been given time to reconsider their position. He asked Daniel to stand and announce that humanity accepted the Council's generous terms. Daniel rose to his feet. Every eye in the room was on him. Every camera focused on his face. He looked up at Eth and spoke clearly and slowly so that there would be no misunderstanding. He said that he had consulted with his government on Earth. He said that humanity was grateful for the Council's offer of protection. However, humanity was born free and would remain free. They would not surrender their sovereignty. They would not accept subordinate status. They came in peace and hoped to leave in peace, but they would not become slaves. The hall fell silent. Eth's red eyes burned with cold fury. He made a small gesture with one hand, and suddenly armed guards surrounded the human delegation. Daniel did not resist as they grabbed his arms. He told his people to stay calm and not to fight. Eth descended from his platform and walked toward Daniel until they stood face to face. He spoke quietly, but the microphones picked up every word. He said that Daniel had made a terrible mistake. He said that the galaxy needed to see what happened to species that the Council. He said that humanity would learn to submit, one way or another. Daniel looked into those ancient red eyes and saw no mercy there. He turned to Laura and spoke quickly in English, knowing that most of the aliens would not understand. He told her to send the message now, whatever happened. She nodded with tears streaming down her face. Eth stepped back and raised his hand. He announced to the assembled representatives that Ambassador Daniel of Earth had been found guilty of defiance against the Galactic Council. The sentence was death. The sentence would be carried out immediately. A guard pressed a device against Daniel's chest. He felt a moment of terrible heat, and then everything went white. The molecular disintegrator broke his body apart atom by atom. Where Daniel had stood, there was only empty air. Laura screamed. The other humans cried out in horror and grief. Guards grabbed them and dragged them away from the hall. As she was pulled through the doorway, Laura fumbled with the hidden transmitter in her sleeve. She pressed the button that sent the data package racing across the stars toward Earth. The message contained everything. The execution footage, the intercepted plans, and a simple note she had added herself. They killed him. They are coming for Earth. Be ready. The guards threw the humans into a dark cell deep within the station. Laura huddled with her colleagues in the darkness and wept for the man who had taught her that words could build bridges between worlds. She wept for the peace that would never come. She wept for what she knew was about to happen. Somewhere far away, the message traveled through space at faster-than-light speed. In 7 hours, it would reach Earth. In 7 hours, humanity would learn that their open hand had been met with murder. Eth returned to his chambers and sent orders to his fleet commanders. 800 warships would depart immediately for the Sol system. They would occupy Earth and force humanity to kneel. The High Chancellor smiled as he looked out at the stars. He had done this before with a dozen other young species. Humans would break just like all the others. They always did. But Eth had made a mistake that would cost him everything. He had studied human history and seen the wars they fought against each other. He had seen their capacity for violence and cruelty. What he had failed to understand was that those wars happened when humans were divided. He did not know what humans became when they united against a common enemy. He did not know about the Annihilation Protocol. He was about to learn. The message arrived at United Nations Space Command headquarters in Geneva at 3 in the morning local time. A young communications officer named Amy Foster was the first to see it. She decoded the transmission and watched the video with growing horror. When the footage showed Ambassador being disintegrated, she dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, but she did not notice. Within 10 minutes, Admiral Christopher Blake was in the command center watching the same footage. He was 61 years old with a face carved from stone and eyes that had seen too many battles. He watched the execution 3 times without saying a word. Then he picked up a phone and made the call that would change human history. 1 hour later, Every world leader was in an emergency video conference. They watched the footage together. They read the intercepted communications that proved the council had planned this murder before the humans even arrived. They saw the final note from Laura warning them that a fleet was coming. Secretary General Price sat in her office in New York and looked at the faces on her screen. She saw shock, grief, and anger. But beneath all of that, she saw something else. She saw unity. For the first time in human history, there was no argument about what needed to be done. The Annihilation Protocol had been created 15 years ago by a secret committee of military strategists, scientists, and philosophers. They had asked themselves a simple question. What would humanity do if they ever encountered an alien species that was willing and able to destroy them? The answer they developed was not a weapon or a fleet or a battle plan. It was a doctrine. It was a promise. If any force proved itself to be an existential threat to humanity, the response would not be proportional. The response would be absolute. Secretary General Price addressed the world 6 hours after the message arrived. She stood in front of the United Nations building with flags from every nation behind her. Billions of people watched on screens around the planet and in the colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter. She told them what had happened. She showed them the footage of Ambassador standing tall and speaking of peace. She showed them his murder. She showed them the Council's plans to enslave Earth. She did not cry. She did not shout. Her voice was steady and cold as she spoke. She said that humanity had reached out to the stars with friendship. They had been answered with blood. Now they would respond. The Annihilation Protocol was active. Every resource, every factory, every laboratory, every ship would serve a single purpose. The Galactic Council would learn that humanity was not a species to be enslaved. Humanity was a species to be feared. Across the world, people who had spent their lives arguing about borders and politics and religion looked at each other and saw only fellow humans. Factory workers and engineers began working triple shifts. Scientists who had been hiding their true research revealed technologies that the public had never seen. The military forces of every nation combined into a single command structure under Admiral Blake. The galaxy believed that Earth had only modest technology. The diplomatic ships sent to the Council had been carefully designed to appear primitive. It was a test to see how the aliens would react to a peaceful, humble neighbor. The test results were clear. The aliens respected only power. Now they would see power. Deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, doors opened that had been sealed for a decade. Inside were ships unlike anything humanity had shown the galaxy. The Prometheus-class destroyers were sleek and deadly, armed with weapons that could crack planets. The Nemesis-class carriers held thousands of autonomous drones that could overwhelm any defense. The class dreadnoughts carried the most terrifying weapon of all, dark matter warheads that could collapse space itself into microscopic black holes. Admiral Blake stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Constellation. He looked at the 300 ships gathering around Earth and felt the weight of what was coming. He had hoped to retire peacefully. He had hoped to never fight again. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel being disintegrated. He saw the smug smile on Ed's face. He opened his eyes and gave the order to prepare for departure. In Geneva, intelligence analysts worked to identify every species that had participated in the execution or supported the Council's decision. The list was not long. Only the 12 elder races had voted for the death sentence. Only they would face the consequences. Humanity would not make war on the innocent. They would make war on the guilty. Price visited Admiral Blake before the fleet departed. She asked him if he understood his mission. He said that he did. She asked him if he could do what needed to be done. He was quiet for a moment, then said that Daniel had been his friend. They had served together 30 years ago on a peacekeeping mission in Africa. Daniel always believed that humans could find a way to solve problems without violence. Blake had always admired that about him. But Daniel was dead now, murdered in front of the whole galaxy by creatures who saw humans as nothing more than animals to be controlled. Blake said that he would do what needed to be done. He would not enjoy it, but he would do it. And he would not stop until the Council understood that attacking humanity was the worst mistake they had ever made. The fleet departed Earth at noon on a Tuesday. 300 ships burning bright against the darkness of space. They carried 50,000 soldiers, pilots, and crew. Every one of them had watched the execution footage. Every one of them had volunteered for this mission. Some of them would not come home, but all of them knew why they were fighting. As the fleet entered faster-than-light travel, Admiral Blake broadcast a message to every ship. He told them to remember Daniel. He told them to remember the 31 crew members still being held prisoner on the council station. He told them that humanity had tried peace and peace had failed. Now they would speak a language that the elder races understood. They would speak the language of fire and steel and death. Behind the fleet, Earth continued its transformation. New ships were being built at a rate that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Weapons were being manufactured in factories that had never made anything more dangerous than cars. Children drew pictures of Ambassador and hung them in their windows. The whole species was awake now, united by grief and fury and a terrible determination. The Council fleet was still 7 days away from Earth. They expected to find a frightened, primitive world ready to surrender. They had no idea what was waiting for them. They had no idea that they were flying toward their doom. In her cell on the Council station, Laura felt the vibrations of ships departing. She did not know if her message had reached Earth. She did not know if anyone was coming to save her, but she remembered what Daniel had always told her: never underestimate humanity. When pushed into a corner, humans did not curl up and die. They fought back with everything they had. She held onto that hope in the darkness and waited for whatever came next. The Council invasion fleet entered the Sol system expecting to find a primitive world trembling in fear. Fleet commander of the had been given simple orders by High Chancellor Ev: destroy any resistance, occupy the planet, bring the human leaders to the Council in chains. He had done this many times before with other young species. It was almost boring work. His 800 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel near the edge of the system. Sensor officers immediately began scanning for the location of Earth's defense forces. What they found made them freeze at their stations. Commander pushed his way to the main display and stared at the image with disbelief. 300 human warships hung in perfect formation between his fleet and Earth. They were not the primitive vessels the Council had seen before. These ships bristled with weapons that his sensors could barely identify. Energy readings suggested power sources far beyond anything a young species should possess. Felt something he had not felt in centuries of military service. He felt fear. A communication signal came from the human fleet. Commander accepted it and found himself looking at a human male with gray hair and cold eyes. The human introduced himself as Admiral Christopher Blake of the United Nations Space Command. He spoke slowly and clearly, and his words were translated into the common tongue. Blake said that the Galactic Council had murdered a man who came in peace. He said that the Council had declared war on humanity. He said that humanity accepted this war. The Council fleet could surrender now and be allowed to return home, or they could fight and be destroyed. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. Choose. Commander laughed. His species had conquered 1,000 worlds. His fleet outnumbered the humans nearly 3-1. These primitives had some impressive ships, but they could not possibly stand against the might of the elder races. He gave the order to attack. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians for centuries. The Council ships surged forward, firing weapons that had shattered every enemy they had ever faced. Their beams and missiles raced toward the human fleet with enough power to destroy cities. The human ships did not move. They did not need to. Energy shields flared to life around each vessel, absorbing the Council weapons as if they were nothing. Then the humans fired back. Dark matter warheads launched from the dreadnoughts. Each one created a tiny singularity that pulled nearby matter into itself before collapsing. Council carriers vanished into points of impossible density, crushed into nothing in seconds. Plasma lances from the Prometheus destroyers cut through alien hulls like hot knives through butter. Swarms of hunter-killer drones poured from the Nemesis carriers, overwhelming point defense systems and tearing ships apart from the inside. Commander watched his fleet die around him. He gave the order to retreat, but his ships could not enter faster-than-light travel. The humans had deployed dimensional anchors that locked nearby space into a stable state. There was no escape. 4 hours after the battle began, it was over. Not a single Council ship survived. 800 vessels carrying 500,000 crew members were gone. The human fleet had lost 3 ships and 247 lives. Admiral Blake felt each of those deaths like a wound, but he did not let it show on his face. He gave the order to proceed to the next phase. Captain Davis led a special operations team to the Council station where Laura and the surviving crew were held. Her team consisted of 100 soldiers equipped with the best weapons and armor humanity could produce. They arrived in stealth shuttles that the station defenses never detected. The rescue was fast and brutal. Davis and her team cut through station security in minutes. The guards had never faced humans in combat before. They had been told that humans were weak and primitive. They learned the truth as they died. Laura heard the sound of gunfire growing closer to her cell. She did not know if it was rescue or execution. The door exploded inward, and she saw humans in black armor with weapons raised. One of them pulled off her helmet, revealing a woman with short brown hair and fierce eyes. She said that she was Captain Davis and that she was taking them home. Laura began to cry. She asked about Earth, about whether they had received her message. Davis smiled and said that Earth received everything. She said that the Council fleet that was coming to enslave them was already destroyed. She said that humanity was coming for the Council now. The rescue team brought the survivors back to the human fleet. Admiral Blake welcomed Laura personally and told her that she had done her job well. Her message had given Earth the warning it needed. Daniel would have been proud of her. Laura said that Daniel would have wanted them to find another way. Blake nodded and said that they had tried another way. It was the Council who chose this path. The human fleet regrouped and began its advance toward Council space. But Admiral Blake did something unexpected. He stopped at every system controlled by species that were not part of the Council. At each stop, he broadcast the truth. He showed the footage of Ambassador being murdered for asking to be treated as an equal. He showed the intercepted communications proving the Council had planned to enslave humanity before negotiations even began. He offered a simple message to all the species who lived under Council rule. He said that humanity's war was with the 12 elder races who had committed this crime. They had no quarrel with anyone else. If any species wished to free themselves from Council control, humanity would not stop them. If any species wished to fight alongside humanity, they would be welcome. The choice was theirs. The response was beyond anything Blake had expected. Species that had been conquered and controlled by the Council for thousands of years saw their chance. Uprisings began on dozens of worlds. Ships that had served the elder races turned their weapons on their masters. The careful order that the Council had maintained for 50,000 years began to crumble. Admiral Blake sent a transmission to the Council station. High Chancellor Eth appeared on the screen, looking older and more afraid than he had in the execution video. Blake did not threaten or shout. He simply played the execution footage back at Eth, then spoke a single sentence: "We are coming." The human fleet continued its advance. Every week, they destroyed more Council forces. Every week, more subjugated species joined the uprising. The 12 elder races sent delegation after delegation to negotiate, but Blake refused to speak with anyone but Eth himself. And the High Chancellor, safe in his chamber on the Council station, refused to lower himself to bargaining with primitives. Laura watched it all from a small office on the flagship. She had been offered passage back to Earth, but she chose to stay with the fleet. She still believed in what Daniel had taught her. Someday, this war would end. Someday, someone would have to build peace from the ashes. She intended to be there when that day came. But first, the guilty had to face justice. First, Eth had to answer for what he had done. The fleet pressed forward, burning a path through the stars toward the heart of the Council's power. Behind them, the galaxy was changing forever. 6 months had passed since the execution of Ambassador Daniel. In that time, the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. The empire that the 12 elder races had built over 50,000 years was falling apart. Their fleets were shattered. Their vassal species had risen in rebellion. They were surrounded by enemies who smelled blood in the void. Admiral Christopher Blake stood on the bridge of the constellation as it emerged from faster-than-light travel above the. This was the heart of the Galactic Council's power, the seat of High Chancellor Eth himself. Around Blake's flagship, 200 human warships took up attack positions. Mixed among them were vessels from 20 different species that had joined the human advance. The coalition of the willing, some called it. The army of the wronged, others said. It was beautiful from space. Blue oceans and green continents under wisps of white clouds. 12 billion inhabitants lived on that world, most of them civilians who had nothing to do with the Council's decision to murder Daniel. Blake looked at that world and felt the weight of what he could do. With a single order, he could end it all. Dark matter warheads could turn that beautiful planet into a dead rock. But Blake was not a monster. Humanity had not come to commit genocide. They had come for justice. A communication signal arrived from the planet's surface. Secretary General Price appeared on the screen. She had traveled to the front lines for this moment, the moment when humanity would dictate terms to the species that had tried to enslave them. The terms were simple. The 12 elder races would disarm completely. They would surrender all warships and weapons of mass destruction. They would pay reparations to every species they had wronged during their 50,000 years of rule. They would publicly admit to their crimes, including the murder of Ambassador, and High Chancellor Eth would stand trial for that murder before a galactic tribunal. For 3 days, the government refused to respond. Blake ordered his fleet to destroy every military installation in the system. Orbital stations, shipyards, defense platforms, all of them burned. Still, the civilian population was not touched. On the 4th day, they agreed to all terms. Eth himself appeared on the communication screen, looking like a shadow of the proud creature who had ordered Daniel's death. He said that the council would accept human terms. He asked only that his people be treated with mercy. Blake stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he asked if Eth had shown mercy to Daniel. He asked if the council had shown mercy to the hundreds of species they had crushed over thousands of years. He asked if mercy had been in their minds when they planned to enslave Earth before negotiations even began. Eth had no answer. Blake said that humanity would show more mercy than the council deserved. The civilian population would not be harmed. The culture and history of the elder races would be preserved, but the council itself was finished. A new order would rise in its place. The trial of High Chancellor Eth was broadcast across the entire galaxy. It was held on the same station where Daniel had been murdered, in the same chamber where his body had been destroyed. Representatives from 300 species watched as the ancient was led in chains to stand where Daniel had once stood. Laura served as the primary witness. She told the tribunal everything she had seen and heard during those terrible days. She described Daniel's hope that peace was possible. She described his dignity in the face of contempt. She described the moment when he was killed for the crime of believing that his species deserved to be free. By the time she finished speaking, there was not a dry eye among the human observers. Even some of the alien representatives seemed moved. The verdict was never in doubt. Eth was found guilty of crimes against sentient life. The sentence was life imprisonment on a barren asteroid at the edge of known space. He would live out his remaining centuries in isolation, watching through a small window as the empire he had built crumbled to dust. Death would have been a mercy. Humanity did not feel merciful. After the trial, the real work began. Secretary General Price proposed the creation of a new governing body to replace the council. It would be called the Galactic Assembly, and it would be built on a simple principle that the council had rejected. Every species, young and old, would have an equal voice. There would be no elder races and subordinate races. There would only be citizens of the galaxy. Many of the former council species resisted this idea. They had ruled for so long that equality felt like defeat, but they had no power to refuse. Their fleets were gone, their economies were shattered, and they were surrounded by species who remembered every cruelty they had suffered under council rule. The first session of the Galactic Assembly was held 1 year after Daniel's death. Representatives from over 400 species gathered in a new chamber built specifically for this purpose. Laura, now the first human ambassador to the Assembly, rose to give the opening address. She spoke of Daniel and his dream of a galaxy united in peace. She spoke of the war that had followed his death and the terrible price that had been paid. She spoke of the choice that now lay before every species in the galaxy. They could repeat the mistakes of the past, building new empires and new hierarchies that would inevitably lead to new wars, or they could try something different. They could build a future based on respect and cooperation, where no species was considered lesser and no grievance was allowed to fester until it exploded into violence. Admiral Blake was not present for the speech. He had retired from military service immediately after the war ended. He returned to a small house in Montana where he had grown up, far from the stars and the ships and the death. Sometimes he looked up at the night sky and thought about all the lives that had been lost. Sometimes he dreamed about Daniel, his old friend, standing in that chamber and asking for nothing more than respect. On the station where Daniel had died, a monument was erected. It showed him as he had been in life, standing tall with one hand extended in friendship. An inscription was carved into the base in every language used by every species in the galaxy. It read, "We came in peace, we were answered with blood, we replied in kind, let this be remembered." Every species that joined the assembly was required to visit the monument and read those words. It was a reminder of what had happened and why it could never happen again. It was a promise from humanity to the galaxy. They would always offer an open hand first. They would always seek peace before war. But if that open hand was met with violence, the galaxy now knew what the hand concealed. Laura visited the monument on the first anniversary of Daniel's death. She stood alone in the quiet chamber and looked up at his carved face. She told him that his dream was coming true, slowly and imperfectly, but it was coming true. Species that had been enemies were learning to work together. Trade was flowing between worlds that had never spoken before. Children were growing up in a galaxy that was more free and more fair than it had ever been. She told him that she missed him. She told him that she would keep working until the dream was complete. Then she placed her hand on the cold stone of the monument and walked away to continue building the future that Daniel had given his life to create. The galaxy would never forget what humanity had done. They had arrived as newcomers asking for friendship. They had been dismissed as primitives. They had been attacked and they had responded with overwhelming force. But when the war was won, they had not become conquerors. They had become builders. That was the true measure of humanity. Not how they fought, but what they built when the fighting was done. And in the darkness of his prison asteroid, Eth watched it all and finally understood his mistake. He had seen humans as weak because they spoke of peace. He had not understood that they spoke of peace because they knew exactly what they were capable of when peace failed. That knowledge haunted him for the rest of his long and lonely life.